In today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you my favourite tried and true method for keeping track of increases and decreases. Hello and welcome to the Crimson Stitchery, a video channel about making all things beautiful and useful. My name is Anushka and you can find relevant links to this video in the down bar here on YouTube. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you my favourite tried and true method for keeping track of increases and decreases. There are loads of different ways to do this, from the most analogue to the most technological. I know that you can download apps to help you keep track of this kind of thing. And personally, I just used to take note of my increases and decreases in a project by doing a tally in the margin of my pattern if I'd printed it off, or keeping a little record in a notebook, or even just on a post-it or something like that I would put in my knitting bag. However, what would inevitably happen would be that I would just forget to write it down, or I wouldn't have my notebook or piece of paper at hand when I needed it, or I would just, furiously want to keep on knitting and not actually stop to bother to note what I'd actually done in my work. And so over time I developed a very straightforward method of how to track your increases and decreases in your knitting project itself, and I'm happy to share it with you today. Without further ado, let's get started. Here's a sweater that I'm currently working on. As you can see, it's a yoke style sweater. For those of you who are interested, the name of this pattern is called Arachne, but aside from the yoke directions, I actually completely did my own thing for the sweater. So I'm not following the designer's instructions for the sleeves or the body shaping. I'm doing my own thing there based on my own calculations, and that is because I chose to make this sweater using a different weight of yarn than what was recommended. So I knit it at a different gauge, therefore all these calculations were necessary, and I knit it from the top down. So I cast on at the neckline, knit down the yoke, separated stitches for sleeves and body, then I knit down the body, and then now I'm working on each sleeve. So I've done the first sleeve here, and the second sleeve is currently a work in progress. So there's been several types of increases and decreases in this project, both hidden within the yoke and also later through the body in order to create some shaping, because the human body isn't a series of oblong shapes, but is quite complex. And then more shaping through the sleeve. So this method tracks your increases and decreases directly on the fabric, which means that you've got to be able to read your knitting and understand what exactly has been going on in the actual fabric that you have been creating. As you can see, I've got quite a lot of extras on my knitting, and I get asked about this kind of thing all the time. And what I've got here are a series of different lamp bulb stitch markers, and they're in all different colours, which is a coded system that I've come up with in order to track my increases and decreases. And here's my lamp bulb stitch marker. As you can see, it's a safety pin kind of thing, and it's very easy to just clip it open and shut. And then this bulb shape does fit on quite a lot of needles. It's not the biggest in the world, so you might struggle to get it above a 6.5mm needle or so, but I feel like for most sweater weights it's perfectly adequate. And in any case, the way that I use them tends to be that I insert them into the knitting as opposed to putting them round the needle like you might do with normal ring kind of stitch markers. And I ordered these in a little box, and I got hundreds of different coloured stitch markers. I'm just laughing because this box did used to have different compartments and they were organised by colour, but I happened to drop them on the floor more than once and now they've just got all mixed up. Drop me a comment down below if this has happened to you with things like safety pins or normal pins or anything like that. So I just ordered these online. I'll put a link in the description box below, and just got a big multi-pack of all different colours that come in their own box, as you can see here. What I've got here are a series of different stitch markers. They're in all different colours, which is a coded system that I've come up with in order to track my increases and decreases. I'm using coloured stitch markers to track decreases, and then I've got these metallic silver ones at the bottom to track increases. So I've got different types of things going on. And then also here at the top I've got a white stitch marker which tracks the beginning of the round. So that one I actually inserted into the fabric as opposed to carrying it round and round with me on the needle as I'm knitting the project. And I do that just because when it comes to beginning of round stitch markers, when I work in the round, I tend to just end up dropping them off the needle. So it's easier for me if I insert them into the actual knitting. So now I'll just explain what I do to track the decreases on a pair of sleeves. And then after that, I'll just talk about what I do on different parts of the sweater. So here I've got my first sleeve from armpit to cuff. And as I said, I'm devising my own sleeve decreases for this project because if I look at the anatomy of my own arm, the upper arm tends to be a lot more uniform in circumference. I don't have particularly bulging biceps, but nor are my arms like stick arms. And then from the point of the elbow down to the wrist, my arms decrease in circumference much more quickly. The diagonal line becomes much more pronounced. And I'm reflecting that in the way that I do my decreases in my sleeve. So my decreases are spaced much more widely apart above the elbow because I don't want to, get too narrow too quickly. And then once I hit the elbow, there's many more decreases in the length of fabric. So above the elbow, I've only got 3 pairs of decreases, and below the elbow, I've got 7. And I'm reflecting the different decreases by using different colours. I've got lilac above the elbow and I've got dark blue below the elbow. Now, depending on your personal, size, your fit, and also the knitting pattern that you're working from, the way that the designer has written the pattern, and whether there's any shaping or how closely it follows anatomy, your sleeve decreases, or conversely increases if you're working from the cuff up towards the armpit, your way of working that may vary, but you can still track them in this exact same way, which is that you just start off by figuring out how many increases or decreases you're going to be working. And then you grab your box of lamp bulb stitch markers and pick out the relevant number of stitch markers. So here I've got my selection of 3 lilac and 7 blue, and then I'm just going to take my first lilac, open it up, and I'm going to thread on all of the other stitch markers onto it. And then when it comes to my actual sleeve, I will insert the first stitch marker into the fabric at the point where I've actually made the decrease. So when I start my knitting, I've got loads of them all hanging out here. This requires you to be able to read your knitting, and just bear with me for now because I'll be explaining that shortly towards the end of the video. So now I've got all of these stitch markers just hanging out, and I'll keep knitting. As you can see, I've continued knitting on this project here until I get to the point where I'm ready to do my next decrease. And after I've done that decrease, I'll just take out the next relevant stitch marker, and then I will insert it into the fabric at the point of the decrease. And so I'll just keep working up my sleeve, counting the number of plain rows, and then after I've worked my decrease row or my increase row, I'll take out a stitch marker and insert it into the increase or the decrease stitch itself. Which is where, if we get to my second sleeve, you can see I've done that because I've been inserting the stitch markers at periodic intervals. And again, I changed colour from lilac to blue to mark that I was having to count fewer rows. So the distance between the 2 lilac markers was 16 rows, and the distance between the 2 blue markers was only 10 rows. And so by the time that I have removed all of the markers from the first one, because they've been inserted all the way down the sleeve, it's time to stop decreasing and move on to the next part of the sleeve, which in this case was the cuff. I did the exact same thing when it came to the body. I counted the amount of decreases down to the waist and then increases across towards the hips. and I took out all of those markers, and again I chose metallic markers for the increases and coloured ones for the decreases, so that it was quite obvious, you know, once I'd used up all of the green coloured ones, it was time to move on to the metallic, which signalled to me that I had to start doing increases instead and make that change. Now I'll just make a quick note about reading your knitting. Doing this method tracks increases and decreases directly on the fabric. In my opinion, there's no great shortcut towards how to learn to read your knitting beyond becoming observant and beginning to pay really, really close attention to what's going on in the fabric as you knit, as you handle it and do different things and manipulate it with your needles, and pay close attention to detail, noticing the shifts in the shapes of the stitches and how the fabric is altering. When it comes to increases and decreases, there are absolutely loads of them. They all have different effects and they all look slightly different. And I'm not going to be able to cover all of them in this video, but I'll just demonstrate briefly what I mean by paying close attention. So here I've got a piece of stocking stitch knit flat, and what I'm going to do now is demonstrate reading your knitting for a simple knit two together. So I've got to the point at which I want to do my decrease, and I do my knit two together, so two become one. This stitch that I've just knit, that has just gone onto the right hand side needle, this is the decrease stitch. And so this is the one that I'd want to track with my stitch marker. And I'll do that by inserting the stitch marker into that stitch. Now you can either do it straight away on the right hand side needle when you've got the, the live stitch so that you don't forget. If you don't want to do this because you find it a little bit fiddly when you come back and actually knit that stitch with the stitch marker still in it, then you can wait until the next row and insert it, but don't forget to insert it. For that reason, I tend to just stick it in straight away. Now, if I move the stitch marker out of the way for you, again, this stitch right here was the decrease stitch that we marked. Underneath, we can see in the below row that two stitches are being brought together and melded together, and that's been due to the action of inserting your needle into them together to make the knit two together. So it's important to notice what's happened and realise that this stitch at the top was the decrease stitch, and the stitches below are the consequences of what happens after you've done the decrease. So the way that I think about reading my knitting is by thinking about the result that I'm aiming for, the action that's required to get that result, and the ensuing consequences. So result, action, consequences. In this case, the result was to decrease. The action was the act of knitting it two together, so two becoming one, and the consequences are that we've got we can quite clearly see when we're looking at the piece of knitting where the knit two together was, because we've got that, that sucking together. And, if I was doing different types of increases, for example, if I was doing a make one where I lift up the bar in between the two stitches and pop it on the needle and then knit into the back of that stitch, again, the result was that I increased. The action was this lifting up of the bar, which creates this tiny little mini stitch here. And the consequence was that I can see this kind of extra little mini me next to the stitch there. The same thing applies if we are doing a lace increase, so a yarn over. The result is that I'll be increasing, and I do that with the action of wrapping the yarn around the needle, and that creates a hole here. And that's the consequence. The consequence is the hole, but the actual increase stitch was this yarn over at the top. It's just a very basic memory device, but sometimes when I am trying to read my knitting and track where exactly my increase and decrease row was, sometimes I can get a little bit mixed up between the result row, the row where you actually got the extra stitch or, minus stitch, whichever it may be, and the row below that where the consequences of the increase and decrease live. So in this case, the consequence is the hole, or it could be the extra child stitch, the baby on the back of the mother in the wrapper. Or it could be, for the knit two together, the two stitches being, sucked in towards each other. So it's important to be able to distinguish which is the actual row where the increase or decrease happened and which is the row where there were just the repercussions of that action, the consequences. And the only real way to become really au fait with this is just by practicing and just by noticing every time you have a new project where you're doing different types of increases and decreases or whatever it should be. Just really pay attention to what's going on in the actual fabric, and that way you will learn. So that's it, that's my method. The most interesting part of using this method is the way that it teaches you to learn how to read your knitting and how to work out what exactly is going on in the fabric that you're producing at any given time when you've got shaping. Developing this skill is only going to make you stronger as a knitter overall. So in my mind, this method has the dual benefit of just being very easy to work and actually giving you an additional skill and tool to use in the future. Had you heard of this method before, or is it something new to you? Let me know in the comments, and do let me know if you've got any other tips and suggestions for what you do to keep track of increases and decreases, or whatever else is happening in your knitting. The Crimson Stitchery is a video channel about knitting, about mending and living a creative lifestyle. For the channel, I normally release a vlog at the end of every month sharing everything that I've been making, as well as regular tutorials, tips and discussion topics. I'm generally happy to take suggestions from viewers, especially regarding tutorials. So if there's something else that you'd like to see on the Crimson Stitchery, feel free to drop me a comment down below. Lastly, just a quick shout out to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon who support this channel with a monthly subscription in exchange for a whole host of different exclusive benefits. Patrons are the ones really allowing me to continue investing time and resources into this channel to create videos for the knitting community at large. Thank you so much to all of my patrons, and if this is something that interests you, do head over to patreon.com/thecrimsonstitchery to check out more and choose the right tier for you. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and I'll see you again at the Crimson Stitchery sometime